Forward with Hooley Smith. App centered one that went wide, and Chapman is lying on the ice with Hooley Smith as their skates were tied. They're up now. Charlie Conacher shoots the puck back to his own net to Carr. Carr, the American.
There was a time when Brooklyn was the center of the world.
There was a lively community of all sorts of people. There were theaters, there were trolleys, and there was professional sports.
We even had the Brooklyn Dodgers. Then, as if by divine right, we became the Brooklyn Americans, and they became us.
And I used to go to any American game. Paid 75 cents to sit in the end balcony.
Stolen from Hamilton, Ontario to fill the new Madison Square Garden and birthed with a bootlegger's dough, they were fated to be perennial also-rans.
It all led to the Hamilton Tigers becoming the New York Americans.
And then the fantasy met the facts, and the facts were joyless and bitter. Just like that, the Amerks were gone.
You could argue that this different vision of Brooklyn, not as the center of the world, begins when the Americans are deprived the opportunity to play.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Well, hello there, friends. How are you doing? I appreciate you giving us a spin on your little podcast listening device, whatever that might be, in the car, on the go, while you're running in the bike, whatever you're doing. We thank you for coming to our little show. We call it Good Seats Still Available, our curious little podcast journey, each and every week, if you can believe it, into what used to be in professional sports. My name's Tim Hanlon. Battling a cold this week, but we persevere. We press on, as we say, into our indefatigable journey into forgotten sports history. This week, we have a splendid little show that goes back into ice hockey. We, as you may remember, a couple of weeks back, we had our friend Andrew Ross on talking about sort of the years prior to what the NHL would like to conveniently call the original six. And as you know, you hockey fans out there, the original six is a misnomer by all stretches of the imagination. There was a whole bunch of years when the NHL, in its more frisky days, shall we say, was quite an interesting little effort and journey going on. And one of those teams that stuck out in our conversation with Andrew is a team that we're going to be focusing on with our conversation this week with our guest Dale Morrisey. And it's about the New York Americans, for 1 year known as the last year of their existence, the Brooklyn Americans. And this is a team that literally was the last one to be pruned, shall we say, from the NHL in the we'll get into it, 1942, 1945. The real officialness of it is debatable, but it was the last team to be hived off of the National Hockey League. And that actually then became, or for the 25 years that followed, the quote-unquote original six teams. So the New York/Brooklyn Americans, that's our focus today with film documentarian Dale Morrisey. And we're going to be talking about not only the team and the forgottenness of this team, right? You New York Rangers fans think that you were the sort of first NHL franchise in the metropolitan area. No. And that's why this episode and this little series, this little podcast exists. We want to correct those wrongs and learn more about them. We're going to talk about a movie, actually, that Dale created. It's a documentary called Only the Dead Know the Brooklyn Americans. And you heard a little sort of promo at the beginning of the show. And yes, the dulcet tones of Larry King, of all people, the one of the more famous Brooklynites out there, now enjoying life out in Los Angeles, following the original Brooklyn Dodgers now in Los Angeles. Have been for some time. You may often see him on Dodger broadcasts behind home plate, sitting next to Bert Sugarman and his lovely wife, Mary Hart. Larry is a fixture at Dodger games, but as a Brooklyn native, is the narration behind this very fine film called, again, Only the Dead Know the Brooklyn Americans. And Dale Morrisey is the director, the producer, the writer of it, and it's a fascinating tale. It's got all kinds of intrigue. There's amazing storylines, plural, and we're going to get into all of that. The history of the New York Americans / Brooklyn Americans, also known as the Amerks. That was sort of their nickname. Nobody really seems to know why that contraction became the convenient way of referring to the team, although it makes a lot of sense, but there's doesn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to it. But we'll also refer to them as the Amerks during the course of this conversation. And that's coming up with Dale in just a couple of seconds. So stay tuned. I learned a whole ton of stuff, and I think you will too, and probably hopefully enjoy it as well. A couple of promotional things. Let's get those going and out of the way, shall we? Oldschoolshirts.com is the place from Cincinnati land in the beautiful state of Ohio. P.F. Wilson and friends, the proprietors of such site, oldschoolshirts.com. It is a great place to find high-quality T-shirts that are largely devoted to things from the past, teams, leagues, logos, hell, even shopping malls and department stores and amusement parks and all kinds of other things that may have faded from your memory but have not been forgotten by oldschoolshirts.com in beautiful and convenient T-shirt form. And once you find something and stumble across something you might like there, and I do believe you'll find a New York or Brooklyn Americans T-shirt in the offerings there. So perfect excuse to use that promo code Good Seats and get 10% off all your purchases there at oldschoolshirts.com. Now, you don't have to just buy an Americans shirt, but anything you find there, anything on the site, buy 1, buy 10, buy 100, buy for your friends, your neighbors, whatever. Go for it. Oldschoolshirts.com, and make sure you use the promo code Good Seats and enjoy on us 10% all of your purchases. We also want to remind you about our friends out in San Diego and our particular friend, Dean Mitchell, who's been a longtime sponsor of this show, and his site is called sportshistorycollectibles.com. Sportshistorycollectibles.com, once you've done getting your shirts, is the place to go to find all your other memorabilia stuff around teams and leagues formerly alive and well, but for whatever reasons, no longer. And that's buttons and pennants and media guides and programs and unit bumpers, all kinds of stuff, but playing cards, all kinds of stuff from teams and leagues. I don't know if he's got American stuff in there. They probably does. There are a lot of reissues and stuff, and the colorful sweaters of the New York / Brooklyn Americans, which we'll get into in our chat in a second. But give them a check out. It's sportshistorycollectibles.com. And when you decide to purchase something there, make sure you use the promo code Good Seats at checkout on that site. Good sportshistorycollectibles.com. Oh boy. Long day. 15% off. Yes, 15% off all of your purchases there. Use that code Good Seats at sportshistorycollectibles.com. And then one last promotional item I don't want to forget, our good friends at Audible for all your audiobook needs. If you want to get a free month of the audiobook service known as Audible, it's the best on the planet, and enjoy a free audiobook download for yours to keep, right? It is yours to keep, no matter how long your device lives, even if you cancel the service. Why not give it a try? It's basically risk-free. You can cancel at any time, and the place to do it, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Yep, audibletrial.com/goodseats. Get your free audiobook download, a free 1-month trial of the subscription service at Audible. You can cancel at any time. And like I said, the downloaded book, the downloaded audiobook that you do put on your device, it is yours to keep, even if and when you cancel the service. And we thank you for giving Audible a try at audibletrial.com/goodseats. All right, we have exhausted not only myself, but all of our promotional banter, and we thank all of our sponsors, of course. We can't do this show without them, and we appreciate you giving them a try. We also appreciate you giving a listen to our very fine conversation with Dale Morrisey, and an intriguing one about the forgotten New York City-based NHL hockey team known as the New York, and then for 1 year, Brooklyn Americans. Coming up right here on the show. There is this team called the New York, and then for one brief year, the Brooklyn Americans. And why don't we start with perhaps how this team, in both of its, I guess, incarnations, came across your radar, which hopefully is a segue into maybe your professional and or other interests in life?
Sure. So I was working on a film about a guy named George Patterson, who scored the first goal for the Toronto Maple Leafs back in February 1927. The night they had stopped being the Toronto St. Patrick's and officially became the Toronto Maple Leafs on a cold night in February 1927. They donned these Toronto Maple Leafs hockey sweaters, and they played against the New York Americans, ironically enough, at the Mutual Street Arena in Toronto. And this tall, sort of prototype power forward, before they were power forwards, sort of player named George Patterson slammed home the first goal in the history of the Toronto Maple Leafs. And so I was working on a documentary about this guy who'd sort of become lost to the history of not just hockey, but to the history of Toronto Maple Leafs fans and to the team itself. And so how I stumbled upon the New York Americans is after his very brief stint with the Leafs, he went on to have a very good NHL career, and a good chunk of that was playing for the New York Americans. And so I was looking for somebody to talk to me about the New York Americans and about George's time with the Amberks. And I reached out to a guy named Stephen M. Cohen, who was a member of SIR, the Society for International Hockey Research. And he emailed me back, and he said, well, it just so happens that the Brooklyn Historical Society has this temporary exhibit about the Brooklyn Americans. Why don't you come down, interview me here, and you can shoot a little bit of B-roll and do some interviews. So I did that. October 2015, I think it was. And went down and did that, brought my daughter with me, and she helped out a bit. And we did the interview, and we got along really well, and we were kind of looking over stuff. And I knew something about the Americans and stuff, and it kind of fascinated me. And we were talking more and more about how the Americans were kind of lost to history, just like George was. And while we were talking afterwards, while he's signing his releases and we're looking over some of the artifacts, he said, I've always wanted to write a book about this. He said, I haven't got time. And I said to Steve, I said, it would make a great film. And he said, you know what? It would make a great film. You ever want to make a movie? Talk to me. I'd be happy to be a part. My daughter, who was in the 7th grade, she heard all this. We're walking back, trying to find a, hot dog stand or something to eat lunch afterwards. She said, Dad, that's great. This man wants to make a movie with you. And I said, sweetie, guys say that all the time. They don't really mean it. So, and they don't, right? So fast forward about a month or so, and my agent emails me on a panic saying, Dale, we need ideas from you for like 3 more hockey movies. Oh, I'm stumped. So I emailed Steve Cohen and said, did you still actually really mean it? Do you want to make this movie? I get an email from him like 5 minutes later. Yep, we're all in. Absolutely. Great idea. We want not only do we want to make the movie, we want to be executive producers, anything. And that's how I came about doing it.
So you're a filmmaker by trade, or is this sort of a side thing?
Yeah,
for you?
This is how I make a very meager living.
and why hockey in particular, or are there other genres that you're also?
Well, it's history in general, and it just happens that I like sports. I'm a sports guy. I grew up playing hockey and basketball, football. Those are the 3 main sports that I played, and being born and raised in Oshawa, Ontario, just stone's throw from Toronto, a Leafs fan, Toronto Maple Leafs fan since I was born, so long-suffering Toronto Maple Leafs fan, and so I sort of grew up immersed in hockey history, and sort of grew up in the era of Harold Ballard and not so great times for the Leafs, so history was really all we had to cling to as a Leafs fan. And so hockey history was something that was just sort of bred into me, I think. And I have a love of history, and so I work in making history films, and so it just seemed like a natural fit to work on sports history, and it's a nice way to get people interested in history. I think they watch a sports movie that has to be about history, and before they know it, they're learning a little something along the way.
So once you figured out that you had some willing participants to explore this Americans story, how do you give our audience a bit of a sense? Because obviously the armchair historian, I could possibly qualify myself as that. But in terms, I'm really curious, and maybe the audience is too, you have the idea, you have the blessing of your daughter. How do you approach the process? What is the sort of how you look at or approach the story or the themes, or perhaps how you might even architect this? Like, what is the narrative, or give us a sense of sort of how you decide to kind of actually go to it once you decide you're going to do it.
Well, that's a good question, and it's something that you have to map out for every film that you do. So every film is different, and every subject is different. So a lot of the films that I work on are sometimes considered sidebar stories because they'll be about a specific character, a person who might be sort of forgotten about within history or within sports history. So this film was about a team. So what we had to do was break it down a little bit and find characters within the narrative of the team. So it couldn't just be on this date this happened, then on this date this happened, and then insert stat, insert game stat, and so on. Otherwise, it would become really boring really fast. So we had to find some characters that we could pull into the film and that we can focus on, and that the audience could focus on, and they could become interested in, they could root for, even though, again, because these are history films, you know how it's going to end, but you still have to have something to root for. So we had to have a Big Bill Dwyer, who was a tragic figure. We had to have a Red Dutton. We had to have these types of guys in there that you could kind of root for. And then you sort of structure the film in a way that you can sort of form the narrative around these key figures, and they're tragic figures in a way. And then the team itself becomes almost its own character, and it becomes like a David versus Goliath story, and it becomes a tragic story as well. I don't know if that answers your question entirely, but that's sort of the approach that we sort of take.
Sure, no, it does, and I guess I guess sort of the follow up to that is how much of the story did you know or think you knew, or entering and jumping in, and then frankly, as you got into it, with footage and research and articles and microfiche and all those other sort of things, how do you not get sidetracked with all the sort of what I suspect would be rabbit holes of intrigue and discoveries along the way?
Well, one of the nice things is being an outsider looking in. I'm not from New York City. I'm not from Brooklyn. So I don't have that vested interest. And so I don't feel the need to be an apologist when I'm doing these sorts of things. And that helps. How much of the story did I know? I knew that the Brooklyn Americans existed, and I knew that they had come to an abrupt end, and that they were the last team to play before the quote-unquote, and I'm using very large air quotes here, the original six. And I knew that the New York Americans predated the Rangers by a season, and that, one of those great things that you could always, win a free beer at, if you wanted to try and hit somebody up for a beer at a bar and say, oh yeah, who was the first team to play in New York City? And everybody go, oh, the Rangers. And go, no, it was the Americans. And sure enough, all of a sudden you had a beer. And so I knew that stuff. And then I knew a little bit about Big Bill Dwyer, who was the owner, but I didn't know much else. So I didn't know that the Hamilton Tigers were the team that they were basically the shell of the Hamilton Tigers were scooped up and then taken to New York. I didn't know any of that stuff. And and the politics and the back and forth, I didn't know a lot about that, nor did I know a lot about I knew about the Roaring '20s, obviously, but I didn't know about, the Forest Hotel and all these sorts of things. So a lot of that kind of was stuff that you get to dig into. And that's really fun stuff. And as someone who has a degree in history, is a trained historian, before I went into journalism and filmmaking, that stuff is really a lot of fun. And getting to sort of do a lot of the research and then build a narrative around that is a lot of fun. And you end up rooting for these guys. They stop becoming abstracts from the past and just names on paper, and they become real living beings again, and become people that you root for again. And it's a lot of fun.
All right, well, let's set the scene a little bit. So let's, set the Wayback Machine to the, circa roaring 1920s, at least in the United States. And, we've got a booming economy, and we all know what's going to come later in the decade. However, you've mentioned or hinted at some of the interesting characters, shall we say, that kind of almost are pillars, I guess, or foundational poles, if you will, for this story. Maybe we start with Thomas Duggan, right? It's Duggan? Is that how you say it?
Yeah, I say Duggan. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, he's not around to sort of counter us, so I guess we'll agree to call him Thomas Duggan. But maybe you can give the audience a bit of a sense of sort of perhaps maybe why the story kind of maybe has an acorn rootage with him.
So Tommy Duggan is a sports promoter, kind of ne'er-do-well guy, best known in Montreal. He's into horse racing and dog racing. He's into ice hockey, all sorts of things. And he's always sniffing around Mount Royal Arena and that sort of thing. And he's not well heeled. He's not well moneyed, but he's Stan Fischler had a great line in the film. He says he's what you would call a consultant before consultants were before they had the term consultant. So he was the guy always he was a schemer, basically, Tommy Duggan, and so he had this idea. And he pitched to the NHL, which was expanding into the United States. And you have to remember that the NHL, post World War II, it's formed in 1917 at the height of the Great War. But after this, and in the early 1920s, the NHL is a league that's struggling. They're under attack from other upstart leagues. And things aren't going really that well for them. And so Tommy Duggan comes along at a time when they think, hey, maybe this is a good idea. He says, I've got this really great idea. Sell me some franchise rights and I'll go to the U.S. and I'll set them up. Problem is Tommy Duggan really doesn't have the money to get that done. So what he does is he flips these franchise rights. He sells one to Boston. Turns out to be the Boston Bruins. They do okay. And Boston already has a history of hockey. They have a history of amateur and college hockey already. So it's a well set up market. And then he goes on and he sells a team to New York City, which on the surface doesn't seem like a natural fit, but they're building a new Madison Square Garden there, and they need dates. They need dates filled. They've got boxing and they've got indoor bicycle racing and all kinds of other crazy things, a circus, but they need a lot of dates filled. And so hockey would fill a lot of dates. And so this is a good idea. But they don't have a money man. They don't have a guy who will buy the franchise. And that's where a guy named Big Bill Dwyer comes in. Big Bill Dwyer is a gangster. He's kind of like the Al Capone of the East Coast. In a lot of ways, he's probably even bigger than Al Capone. And he's a rum runner, and he does everything. He basically owns the East Coast.
Well, Bill Dwyer, though, was pretty much, he was kind of like sort of the one of the sort of eastern seaboard kingpins of alcohol running, if you will, in during the Prohibition,
Absolutely.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so he's the founder. He's one of the co-founders of the Irish Mob, and so he's got money to burn, and he wants to have something legit. The great thing about having all this money is you're a very wealthy guy, but the thing is people kind of look down on you because they know you're a criminal. They know you're a mob boss. And so, but he wants to kind of break into society a little bit, and he wants something legitimate. So Tommy Duggan introduces him to hockey on one of their, as far as we know, probably one of his trips to Montreal. And he says, hey, I kind of like this game. As they say, there's a sucker born every minute. And so he buys into the franchise. And funny enough, one of the other franchises gets sold to Pittsburgh, and Big Bill Dwyer ends up being the money man behind the scenes, but he ends up being the money man for Pittsburgh as well. So he ends up really, in a roundabout way, owning two hockey teams.
Yeah, the team known as the Pittsburgh Pirates of the NHL at the time. Probably a story for some of our Pittsburgh listeners for another episode. But okay, so before we go any further between sort of this budding relationship between Duggan and Dwyer, any insight as to how they even know each other? Like Duggan would seem to be a hustler of some sort, or sports promoter, sure. But how does a guy like that get intertwined with arguably the big sort of the big heavy in the against the Prohibition in the United States?
Yeah, so their paths would cross. Their paths crossed because of their connections in Montreal. Because Dwyer comes up and he does business in Montreal because a lot of his booze is coming down from Canada, and the distilleries in Montreal, and so that's how their paths cross. And it's just a little bit of a simple twist of fate. And next thing you know, these guys are getting to know each other. So.
All right, so Dwyer becomes interested. That's great, and Duggan sort of got perhaps a fish on the line, so to speak. But it can't happen without Madison Square Garden being part of the mix. And maybe you can sort of tell us how our other friend, our other sort of third pillar in this story, a guy named Tex Rickard. How do you pronounce that?
Tex Rickard, yeah.
Tex Rickard, right. So who is he, and where does he come along, and how does he play a role in this embryonic setup to what ultimately became the Americans?
So George Tex Rickard is a boxing promoter and just a master marketer, and he's part of Madison Square Garden, and Tex gets his start promoting boxing matches out west, and he had a cattle operation, he owned casinos, he did everything. And he's kind of the Donald Trump of his time, in that he's all about the brand. He's all about brand recognition, attaching his name to things, and so he's sort of the main man, and he becomes attached to Madison Square Garden. Is one of the guys who's helping usher Madison Square Garden, the new Madison Square Garden, along, which is the third Madison Square Garden, I guess. Again, not being a New York City guy, I got lost for a while in all the different Madison Square Gardens. But so this one is more uptown, I guess, not the one that's the current one that we think of, but this one's a little further uptown. But so this Madison Square Garden is the one that's being built by Rickard and his group of guys, and so Tex comes up with this scheme that he can lure in a hockey team. And so that's what they do. And they come up with this agreement to bring them all in. And it's what we think of as a sucker's deal. And they lease Madison Square Garden to the New York Americans. And Duggan is the guy who's supposed to be the guy who takes care of all the paperwork. And somehow they miss on this, and they miss putting in a non-compete clause. And so under this lack of non-compete clause, the Madison Square Garden is allowed to have their own hockey team if things go well. Not only are they allowed to have their own hockey team, but the New York Americans have to be willing supporters of this to the NHL and say, yes, we're in support of this. And so I think we kind of see a foreshadowing of where things are going to go on that.
Well, all right, so how is this team essentially being birthed then? Because from what I can tell, Dwyer takes a bit of a public persona in kind of announcing the team name and that kind of stuff versus sort of being behind the scenes. Or do I have that wrong? Is he kind of letting sort of Rickard and Duggan kind of sort of, I mean, I'm just curious as to Dwyer's, how visible or invisible is he in the formative days of getting the team sort of named and going?
Sure, no, that's a good question. So Dwyer is absolutely the money man. Without him, this team doesn't happen because he's the guy who's going to sign all the checks and he's got all the money. But he's also, early on, he is one of the public faces of the team. Things sour a little bit, though, because very quickly the NHL realizes, hey, wait a minute, we have a gangster, no rum runner who's part of the team. So before long, we have Tex Rickard, and then we have Tommy Duggan, and that sort of thing. And those guys sort of becoming governors for the team. So they're the guys who are sort of the front for the team, but really it's Dwyer who is the guy who's the owner of the team. So that's what happens from a paperwork point of view. But at the end of the day, the buck stops with Big Bill Dwyer.
All right, so we'll get to sort of how they sort of initially get a team onto the ice in a second, but maybe to your knowledge, which I couldn't sort of determine in my cursory understanding of the story, is the name of the team, how maybe that came about, and perhaps a bit about the jerseys, which I think still to this day are probably among, if not the most colorful and vivid and I think, frankly, just original jerseys ever to be seen in the NHL, he says humbly.
Yeah, they are pretty impressive jerseys. Although being Canadian, we tend to call them hockey sweaters, but they are pretty impressive. And the Rochester Americans ended up taking over that color scheme and the logo design later on for the AHL. But originally they were supposed to be called the New York American Tigers. Because Dwyer had bought what was originally the Hamilton Tigers, and then he dropped that, and then they just ended up becoming the New York Americans. And so they originally had that star-spangled kind of look, but with a tiger over top of them. And the team, the sweater goes through about 3 or 4 different designs. So there's like a shield, and then there's the Star Spangled, and then there's an NY, and then there's an NYC American type thing with letters all over. They go through a lot of different designs before they get to Brooklyn, and they're just like the white with the red Brooklyn down a diagonal. So they go through a lot of different designs. But the Star Spangled one that is, I think, is the one that they're most familiar and most famous for. And funny enough, skipping way ahead to the 1970s, when the New York Islanders were awarded their expansion franchise, the ownership group wanted to call their team the New York Americans, and were denied that by the NHL. And they had a design put in place that was going to mimic very closely the original New York Americans design. And it would have been a nice fit because they're on Long Island and they're very close, and it would have been a nice fit.
Any insight as to why? I'm going to guess it's because the NHL maybe didn't want to necessarily.
They didn't want to bring up any old memories of that team. Yeah. And I think they could use the licensing with Rochester Americans as a cop-out, but they wanted to leave the past buried in the past.
See, that's very interesting. Now we've stumbled across the Islanders a little bit in our journeys into the WHA and how sort of the NHL used that as a device to kind of hopefully prevent or at least slow down their use of New York as an expansion market when the WHA launched. But I didn't know that, and that seems, that's actually consistent with a bunch of sort of conversations and areas that we've explored thus far where, and again, we're jumping ahead, but, modern day leagues, right? And their, shall we say, selective memories when it comes to teams and maybe predecessor or challenger leagues. Sometimes they're warmly embraced. Sometimes they're begrudgingly so. Sometimes they're whitewashed altogether. And history continues to sort of regurgitate and bring back the issues after such whitewashing, right? And we've seen it with in some of our previous episodes around the WHA, right? There's no, the NHL you could argue kind of almost has a sort of a memory loss when it comes to that, especially in, say, halls of fame and that kind of stuff. We've seen it. So it's very interesting how and why. I'd love to dig into maybe why or some of the intrigue, perhaps, as to why. When you had all that great iconography, right?
Yeah, no, it's very true. And the NHL does it with its own teams as well, and they allow their own teams to do it. And they have a habit of rewriting their own history, sometimes to the detriment of their own fans. They sell their fans a bill of goods sometimes. You can look at the Ottawa Senators when they put a team in Ottawa. They allowed the Ottawa Senators to hang Stanley Cup banners from a previous era's hockey team that had nothing to do with the Ottawa Senators. But they allowed them to hang those Stanley Cup banners and lay claim to them. And you can look at as recently as the Toronto Maple Leafs celebrating, and again, I'm using really big air quotes here, their 100th anniversary recently, when in reality it was only their 90th anniversary. And because under the founder of the team, Conn Smythe, and J.P. Bickle, who said, Toronto Maple Leafs exist now. We bought out the Toronto St. Pat's. They don't exist. These are the Toronto Maple Leafs moving forward. But everything moving forward from that date existed, and they celebrated a 75th, celebrated an 80th, a 90th, a 50th, a 75th, and 80th based on those dates. And then somewhere along the way, different marketing groups within the organization said, "Oh, wait a minute, let's reset the clock, because all of a sudden now we can claim." I'm being very cynical now, but we can reclaim the Toronto St. Pat's and the Toronto Arenas Stanley Cups, and we can reclaim these teams, and they've done that. And all of a sudden they have a whole 100-year history when before they had a 90-year history.
Well, don't worry about being cynical. Cynicism is a specialty here on this little podcast. But I digress.
And now we're getting off topic too. But
yeah, well, that's okay. But all right. But so we're gonna the morass of sort of historical missteps and/or forgetfulness. I think kind of is sort of the last sort of foundational piece to this story before we literally get to the Amherst, their nickname, by the way, in earnest, and that is the aforementioned Hamilton Tigers. Why are they important in this story as the team is getting going?
Sure. Well, so the Hamilton Tigers, another forgotten NHL team, and the Hamilton, for I guess some listeners, some of your listeners, I guess, if they're Americans, they may not know, but Hamilton has long been sort of the emotional whipping boy for the NHL when it comes to expansion. Anytime there's any team that needs to move, they would threaten to move them to Hamilton and get people living in Hamilton all excited and then pull the rug out. They're sort of like Charlie Brown and football.
Probably like the Birmingham of Canada, the Birmingham, Alabama of Canada, especially when it comes to like football. That Birmingham is
exactly, yeah, that's exactly what they are. Yeah, and so, but without Hamilton, the NHL probably would have folded very early on, because what happened was the NHL early days, again, they were under threat, and so they needed to put a team somewhere in Ontario very quickly, and the Quebec Bulldogs, which was a founding team of the NHL in 1917, had folded and was sitting idle, and so they sort of reanimated the team, if you will, and sold it to a a company in Hamilton. And they said, okay, we're going to rename it. We're going to rename it the Hamilton Tigers. And what they did was they propped them up there. And so just like that, by selling them really quickly to the Absol Pure Ice Company, they managed to basically save the NHL. And so, and this happens in the early 1920s. And so for the first little bit, Hamilton, they do okay. They don't do terribly well on ice, but they draw pretty good crowds. And by the mid-1920s, they're slowly improving. And during the 1924-25 season, they have a great season. And in the spring of 2025, they're on the cusp of winning the Stanley Cup. They've made it to the finals, the NHL finals against Montreal, and they beat Montreal. And they're coming back on the train to Hamilton, and the players get together on the train, and they hatch a scheme, and they hatch a revolt. And they say, listen, if we don't get more pay, we're not going to play for the Stanley Cup. And this is a season where there has been there's already been a little bit of expansion, so there's been more games played, there's been a longer training camp, but there's been more pay. So the players figure we're playing more, but we're not getting paid more, so we want more money. And they refused to play in the Stanley Cup final unless they got more money. So the entire matter ends up on the desk of league president Frank Calder. Now, Frank Calder is a no-nonsense kind of guy. He was a retired schoolmaster who ended up being president of the league. So he tells the players, either you play for the Stanley Cup or you're suspended and you forfeit your season. Well, the players called his bluff. Turns out Frank wasn't bluffing, and he suspended everybody. The Montreal Canadiens, who had lost to Hamilton, they end up being elevated to their status, being elevated over Hamilton, and they go on and play for the Stanley Cup against the Vancouver Cougars, I believe, of the Pacific League, and ultimately the Canadiens lost to Vancouver. And if I'm not mistaken, that was the last time that an NHL team lost to an outside team for the Stanley Cup, because after that season it was NHL teams only that played for the Stanley Cup. But so that was sort of the beginning of the end for the Hamilton Tigers. So what happened was Frank Calder suspended the players, and in the process he suspended the team. So fast forward during the summer, and Bill Dwyer comes on the scene and says, well, I got this franchise in New York City, but I got no players. So I want to buy the Hamilton Tigers and move them to New York City. And that's what he thinks he's done. And he offers the rights to Percy Thompson, the GM, $75,000 for all the players. And again, Frank Calder steps in and says, oh, no. This team is suspended. These players are suspended. You can't just do that. And so in the end, Dwyer strikes a deal to get the players, and they go to training camp. And then Calder steps in again and says, well, no, these guys can't play unless they write me a letter of apology. So all the players sit down and pen them letters of apology. And Frank Calder, being Frank Calder, sends the letters back and says, sorry, guys, but these letters, they're not sincere enough. You have to try again. He makes them write a second letter, and only after they write their second letter of apology does he allow them to move on with their hockey lives and play again.
Yeah, it seems, though, a little murky, though, in the history books, as sort of what sort of happened here. Is that definitive, or, I mean, for example, I know the NHL did not continue the history of the Tigers to be incorporated with the Americans, et cetera.
Yeah, so the Absol Ice Company still owns the team, owns the logo, and they basically take back the team and logo, and they end up being rebranded and reborn later on that season as a semi-pro team, and they exist after that as a semi-pro hockey team, and they play in the Canada Pro League or something to that effect, and the Canada Pro Hockey League. And which is sort of like a tier down from the NHL. And so players would play there, and then they would get bought. Their rights would get bought and sold by NHL teams after that. But that was sort of the end of the Hamilton Tigers, just like that. So Frank Calder basically came to an end. And the team was doing okay in Hamilton, but the APSO Ice Company was quite happy to have this come to an end, because it was becoming increasingly expensive to operate the team in Hamilton. And so Frank Calder did them a favor by suspending the team.
Well, it's interesting, though, because it seems like a marriage of convenience because, there seems to be this new team in New York that could use some players, and it looks like Dwyer in particular, or behind the scenes, gets basically all of these players through whatever surreptitious or, curious means. And effectively, I guess without sort of being officially named and or continuous in the history books, effectively, the bulk of the Hamilton Tigers becomes the first roster for the Americans, right?
A lot of them do, yes. He buys a lot of the players. Not all of them, but a lot of them. And he doubles, triples some of their salaries. He offers them huge raises. Some of them are getting like 200% over some of their previous salaries. It's incredible, the amount of money he's throwing at them. And that's not unusual for Big Bill. He was that kind of guy. As long as the money was flowing in, he was quite happy to spend it on anybody and anything. And it meant that he, at least in theory, he was going to get some kind of return. And he figured if he spent a lot of money on these players, he would get a winning product. Didn't really work out for him, but he thought that's what was going to happen.
Well, it would seem, given the performance of the team as Hamilton in their last year there, that they would be off to a fairly decent start as they begin their lives as the New York Americans on December 15th, 1925. Maybe you can take us to that first game, because it seems like it was a pretty big hit, at least in the stands. No.
Well, sure. It was a huge event. It was like the social event of the year in Manhattan. Everybody was there. It was a white tie event. It was that game was a fundraiser for a medical charity. I can't remember the exact charity right now. I have a copy of the program in my research notes. But huge event. Everybody who was anybody was there, including Eleanor Roosevelt, members of the Astor family, just anybody who was society was at that game. And marching bands were there to play national anthems. It was just incredible. It was a spectacle. So they play the Montreal Canadiens, and they end up losing. But that's really not surprising, I think, when you think that these guys from small town Canada were plunked into the middle of Prohibition, New York City, Times Square, filled and surrounded by Big Bill Dwyer and dancing girls and all the booze they could drink and all the parties they could go to. It's probably not surprising that they lost that game, and it's probably not surprising that they lost as many games as they did. What we probably should be surprised about is that they won any games at all.
Well, this was also, I don't know if this was the first major event in the actual Madison Square Garden, but I think it's important to remember, I guess we've sort of hinted at it, that this is a fairly new, almost brand spanking new facility, this Madison Square Garden. So that probably had some allure to it, right, as a major event in a relatively sparkling new building.
Yeah, so Madison Square Garden is pretty much a brand new building, and hockey has been around, played at the amateur level and sort of a semi-pro level. This is the first professional, really truly professional game played. This is the NHL. This is the big time, and it's come to New York City, and it's been promoted as that. And you got to remember, you got Tex Rickard promoting, and this guy knows from promoting, so that helps.
Well, all right. Despite that sort of gangbuster start, and they're relatively morbid on the ice, right? I think they finished fifth overall, 12 wins and a 40 some odd game season. I think the real story, the real intrigue is, again, you alluded to it before, but maybe we dig a little bit deeper into it now, which is the role of Madison Square Garden and this idea of a separate, maybe more wholly or fully or centrally owned by MSG franchise, I guess, of their own? I'm a little unclear on this because you would see they were already in cahoots with, the guys now already that brought the Americans in there. What is why the difference and or the intrigue of perhaps going somewhat of a separate route and creating yet another team, not even after almost a full year of original play with the Americans?
So sure. So here's the reason why. So the Americans, even though they stink the joint out most nights, and because they're too hungover to play or whatever the case may be, most of the times it's because they're too hungover. They are a big draw. They are packing the place every night, and so Tex Rickard and the rest of the guys at MSG are sitting there thinking, okay, we're leasing the arena to Big Bill and company, and we're getting a cut of the gate, a small cut of the gate. But if we owned a team, we would get everything. We would get all of the gate. So why don't we just own our own team? We would still get a cut of the gate from the Americans, but then we would have our own team, and we would get everything then. So to them, this makes perfect sense. Sure, they're cannibalizing their team that they're leasing it to, but they don't really care about the Americans anymore now. The Americans have served their purpose. They have proven that hockey will work at Madison Square Garden. Now they're ready to have their own team, and that's what they do. So they go to the NHL, and they have this agreement signed. It says, hey, the Rangers can exist, and the Americans, not only can the Americans not do anything about it, but they have to support a Rangers franchise being pitched to the National Hockey League. So it's a fait de complete. It's a done deal. If they go there, and the Rangers are a done deal, and that's what happens. And so it's really, I mean, it's murky at some point, but in other ways, it's as crystal clear as brand new ice on a frozen pond, man. I mean, it's just as clear as you can see.
Well, perhaps looking through the lens of history. So I'll ask the sort of naive questions then, maybe two of them. One, the NHL is still a relatively fragile thing, right? And it's only been 1 year, right, that the New York Americans have existed, or maybe even before a full year, right, when some of these machinations were sort of in the works, right? And so that's kind of a riskier bet to place yet a second team, in a brand new market. But then second, why? I guess I'm just curious as to why starting a brand new franchise from scratch versus trying to figure out some kind of way to renegotiate or contort the Americans' contract and relationship to maybe evolve it from a lease relationship to maybe a full ownership stake. Like, why wouldn't a Dwyer and Rickard and those guys, I'm sure they would be more than interested to perhaps receive an offer of some sort. Yeah.
So first of all, there was no offer. There was no interest in that sort of a deal. And so that deal doesn't exist. There's no interest in that. The Madison Square Garden wanted their own team. They wanted their own Rangers. They wanted a second team. And then they wanted Dwyer and those guys to be tenants, and they wanted their own team. That may not make much sense to us looking back, but that's what they wanted.
So it was almost sort of like a perceived double dipping or dual revenue stream versus just getting ownership.
Exactly.
Got it. Interesting.
Yeah, it's greedy. Exactly. And it's some of it's greed, absolutely. And some of it is the concept of creating a built-in rivalry. So in baseball, in New York City, there was a built-in rivalry. And so they thought this same built-in rivalry would work in New York City. And the NHL thought, hey, this will work. Now, what the NHL didn't realize was what you and I you just mentioned, is that they are still a fresh league. They're still a pretty young league, and they don't have They don't have that history to draw on, and they don't have the resources either that baseball did. And so it was going to be a strain, and it turned out to be that. But so what happens is the Rangers become the team that New York City falls in love with, and the Americans sort of become second-class citizens. They become the also-ran team now. They go from being lovable losers to being just losers in the eyes of a lot of people in New York City. They start a slow, steady slide out of the public gaze, and that gaze shifts more to the New York Rangers every season.
Can you give some insight into sort of that first season when there were two teams, the Rangers, the newly christened or created Rangers, and the second year of the Americans? I mean, the next season, right, the Americans finished fourth in this oddly constructed Canadian division where they're the only non-Canadian team.
So that's a bone of contention immediately for the Americans, the idea of this Canadian division. And Dwyer thinks, maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong, but he thinks almost instantly that the fix is in, and that one of the ways that the NHL is out to get him is that they plunk the Americans in a Canadian division, and that Boston and the newly minted New York Rangers have gotten together to try to push him away so that they can get more of the American audience for themselves, and try to sort of, again, kind of hurt the New York Americans a little bit, because now the Americans have to travel more, they have to spend more money, and the players are going to be fatigued more as a result. And so Dwyer's putting all this together, and the conspiratorial in his thinking, maybe, but he might have maybe he has some merit in his thinking of that. Also, the New York Rangers, they hit the ice with a really solidly constructed team, and that helps them a lot. In a way, their team is probably a better team their first year than what the Americans had their first year, and in some ways that's a lot to do with Conn Smythe. Leafs fans, of course, know Conn Smythe is the man. I mean, he's the guy who created the Toronto Maple Leafs, for lack of a better way of describing it. But he starts out as the general manager of the New York Rangers, and he spends that summer leading into the first season putting the New York Rangers together, and only at the 11th hour is he fired by Tex Rickard and the ownership group, because they want a name to be there. They want somebody with name recognition. And Conn Smythe, it's hard to believe that this now, but there was a time when Conn Smythe really wasn't a recognizable name. He was just a guy who'd had some success with the Toronto Varsities and really was not a known hockey man. But so they went with Lester Patrick from the Pacific League, and they sent Conn Smythe packing back to Toronto. So Smythe goes back to Toronto, kind of sulking a little bit. Lester Patrick finishes building the New York Rangers. Interesting story, though. His wife says, "Con, you're going back to New York, and you're getting the rest of the money that you're owed." So he goes back to New York on opening night for the Rangers and gets the rest of his money. On his way back to Toronto, he bets it on a horse race, doubles his money. Then when he gets to Toronto, he bets on a hockey game, doubles it again. So now he's sitting on a whole lot of money. And he's approached by J.P. Bickle, who says, "Con, the Toronto St. Pats are in trouble, and a group in Philadelphia wants to buy them and move them. But if you chip in with me, I think we can keep them here." Con says, "I'll do more than that. I'll become part of the entire ownership group." He does that, and they save the St. Pats, and they become the Toronto Maple Leafs. So Conn Smythe isn't fired by the New York Rangers. Toronto Maple Leafs might be the Philadelphia whatevers instead.
All right. Calm down. We'll be back to our conversation in just a minute.
But I do want to pay some bills around here, And look, we're guilty as anyone, probably more so than anybody, of living in the past, right? The show is about nostalgia and looking back and trying to remember and unearth things about teams and leagues that have come and gone, shall we say. And, it's good. It's good to learn from history and remember some of those things. But look, you can't live in the past, right? You got to keep moving forward. Life goes on. And look, at all the sports and teams and leagues that we follow, there's just so much excitement out there. We've got a fantasy team or 2 or 10. You got sports talk out there. We were talking about modern day sports as it got built up on the shoulders of history in this little podcast. And my guess is that more than a fair share of you listeners out there want to find a decent place to place a little wager or two once in a while, especially when you have an inkling, you got a special feeling, you think you know what's going to happen. Why not make some bucks on that little hunch? But we're here to help you, right? MyBookie is the place to go. It's our brand new sponsor, and we appreciate their patronage of our little show. MyBookie.ag. That's probably the best place that I know of to get going and do some online wagering. And look, you've been living under a rock. You recognize that the courts have changed over the last couple of months, and the mores around gambling seems to be loosening when it comes to sports gambling. And MyBookie is the place to go as far as I'm concerned. MyBookie.ag to get set up and get some good wagers. And they're good at payouts. They're good at all of that service that you expect. I highly recommend them. I've heard nothing but good things about them. You'll see all the online reviews are top-notch as well. And look, we also have you covered too. When you give them a try, use the promo code SEATS, and they're going to match your initial deposit, dollar for dollar, all the way up to $1,000. So if you're looking for some extra scratch to put against some of your hunches, and you want to get some online sports bets out there, MyBookie, it's the place to go. I highly recommend it. And it's mybookie.ag. Make sure you use the promo code, of course, SEATS. SEATS is the promo code, and you're going to get that dollar for dollar match of your initial deposit, all the way up to $1,000. And why not use that extra coinage, shall we say, to hopefully win a couple of good solid bets on your first go around with MyBookie, mybookie.ag. We thank them for their sponsorship of our show. And now back to our conversation.
How do the Rangers become so good so quickly? And how much of this is MSG maneuvering? How much of this is conspiracy with the NHL? How much of this is just dumb luck? What do you think?
No, there's no dumb luck involved. They become so good so quickly because of Lester Patrick. The Americans are a haphazard team. They're a good time team, and they're run that way. The New York Rangers are a tight ship, and they're run almost like military precision, and they're run that way because of Lester Patrick. And so the Rangers go after top talent, and Lester Patrick is a no-nonsense guy, and losing is not acceptable, and fooling around is not acceptable, and that's the approach he takes. The approach he took out west, and the approach he takes with the Rangers, and there's it's no fluke that they win their Stanley Cup in their second season under Lester Patrick.
Yeah, very interesting. Year 2, New York Rangers, Stanley Cup champions.
Yeah.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah.
All right, so clearly by the end of the decade, though, right, it's the gap between these two teams is
widening.
Pretty significant, right? And the Amerks aren't done, though, right? They do make circa 1930 a big-time trade, and arguably a major figure in the franchise going forward, and a guy named Red Dutton. Who's he?
Yeah, it's a big trade for a lot of reasons. Well, I should say for two big reasons. One, Red Dutton arrives, and two, Lionel Conacher leaves. So Lionel Conacher is sort of is I would say arguably the best Canadian athlete of the 20th century. He could do it all. and he pretty much did do it all. In high school, he was the wrestling championship for the province of Ontario in 1920. The following year, boxed, I think it was 4 or 5 rounds against Jack Dempsey. And then that same year, he won the Grey Cup championship when he helped lead the Toronto Argos to victory. So the Grey Cup is sort of like the Canadian Professional Football Championship. He was an excellent lacrosse player. In fact, he was considered a better lacrosse player than he was a hockey player. It wasn't, he didn't even take up hockey until he was, I think, about 16 or so when he started skating. And he didn't even want to play professional hockey. He had to sort of be convinced to go to Pittsburgh to start playing professional hockey. So he was traded from Pittsburgh to the New York Americans. And that's how he ends up there. But playing under the New York Americans and Dwyer's team, I mean, it was Roy Waters who said, join the Americans and laugh yourself to death. And so the Big Bill Dwyer Americans was having a really adverse effect on Conacher. And by the time this trade happened at the start of the 1930-31 season, Conacher was essentially a functioning alcoholic, and it was killing him and it was killing his career. So when he got traded for Montreal Maroons, he basically stops drinking as soon as he gets to Montreal, saves his life, turns his career around, and he goes on to have a Hall of Fame career, and he wins 2 Stanley Cups. He wins one in Montreal, and then he wins another one eventually in Chicago. So that's what happens with Conacher. So for Dutton, the trade means coming from Montreal, where he could have been a leader, but he did win a Stanley Cup in Montreal, and then he goes to New York, where he eventually does become a leader for the team and becomes sort of the guy who sort of, again, this tragic figure with the team. Now, he doesn't become a leader immediately. Dutton has a reputation that followed him through hockey as probably being a hothead and a bit of a prankster and having a knack for mischief. And this knack for mischief actually cost the Americans a shot at the playoffs that season, actually. That spring, they were the Americans had finally pulled ahead of the Montreal Maroons. The Maroons and the Americans had this rivalry. Again, they're in the Canadian division, right? We talked about how the fix was in, and they ended up in the Canadian division. So the Montreal Maroons were their nemesis. And Dwyer had a real hate-on for the Montreal Maroons. And so finally, the Amerks had caught and passed the Maroons. And Dwyer, who, not the smartest guy sometimes, he celebrated a little bit early. He decided to throw a big party for his players. And he had a horse racing ranch out in New Jersey, and he told his boys to gather up the players, his boys being the guys who would have like the, sidearms and stuff, right? His bodyguards and gangsters, and say, okay, gather up the players and fill a couple of limousines up with the good stuff and send them out there for a big party. And so, as you might guess, hockey players and booze, not always a good idea. Hockey players, booze, and horses, even worse idea. And so as the booze was flowing and the hockey players were feeling no pain, Red Dutton started bragging about how talented he was as a horseman and how he could race horses better than anybody else on the team. And so before long, this turned into a bit of a challenge thing, and the players started racing each other on horseback. The first couple of times it went without a hitch until George Patterson had his turn. And as they rounded the first turn, the horse went left and Patterson went right, and he fell down and broke his collarbone. And as he shattered his collarbone, he also shattered the playoff hopes for the team, because George was one of the leading scorers and sort of one of the de facto leaders of the team that year. So thanks to Red Dutton and his horsing around, he kind of screwed the Americans that season out of the playoff shot.
It also seems to be sort of a harbinger of the team's sort of luck, if you will, over the years. Well, all right, let's move a little forward. So a couple of things happened in the early 30s, right? So the team is obviously not performing all that well. I think there was by the time 35, 36 season rolls around, I think there was like the 5th consecutive year they hadn't made the playoffs. And again, that's some feat when you're talking about a league that barely had not even 10 teams, right? So
you have to be really bad to go on a stretch like that.
But also, though, interesting, right? A little thing called prohibition comes to an end, is repealed in December of 33. And that's got to start to hit the pocketbook, literally, of Mr. Dwyer, who arguably his living has sort of been, not completely, but certainly revolving around his sort of control of the alcohol sort of a flow, shall we say, on the Eastern Seaboard. Maybe
Absolutely.
Give a state of the Amherst at that point in time.
Sure. So that happened, and he got hit with a double whammy. Not only did prohibition come to an end, but the IRS is starting to chase him for tax evasion. And so he's on the run from the IRS, and he's running out of money. And eventually the IRS does catch up to him. And so now he's really in hot water. And so he's running out of money, and he can't spend as freely as he used to. And the writing was on the wall for Bill Dwyer and the New York Americans. And so by the mid-1930s, his ownership stake, his ownership of a team, let's say, is sort of in question, and his ability to hold on to the team is called into question by the NHL. And they essentially take the team away from him. And it's that doesn't happen all at once. It sort of happens gradually to Bill. And he makes sort of a couple of Hail Mary attempts to hold on to the team. He tries to move it. He tries to sell it to an ownership group. And in fact, it's the same ownership group that made a failed attempt to move the Ottawa Senators to St. Louis, and that sort of thing. And then he tries to move it as well, and that didn't work out. But eventually the NHL has no choice but to yank the team away from him, and they sort of assume ownership, sort of like a Phoenix Coyotes kind of situation, I guess, to put it in modern terms. And they sort of assume ownership of the team. And Red Dutton is sort of put in place as the president and GM of the club. And he also has been assuming the role of a player coach as well. So Red Dutton ends up taking over everything. And for Red Dutton, this has been a gradual assuming of powers as well. Red's also tried to keep the team afloat. He's loaned Big Bill money over the years to try and keep the team afloat, only to see Bill squander it. Was, even though he dealt in booze, he didn't drink, but he did like to gamble, and he wasn't very good at it. So when Red Dutton would lend him money, Bill would try to double that money to try and make more money for the team, and ultimately he would lose it along the way. So it just didn't work out for Big Bill Dwyer in the end, and so Red Dutton ended up basically running the show.
It seems like Dutton was able to kind of make things work with tape and wire, though, his first couple of years sort of running the show, both as a coach and maybe later as a general manager or operating head. Because in 37-38, they actually made the playoffs for the third time ever.
Not only make the playoffs, but they beat the Rangers in what was at that time the longest playoff game in history of the NHL. And then they went on and they had a heartbreaking loss to the Chicago Blackhawks after that. But they stunned the New York Rangers because they weren't supposed to win, and the Rangers were shocked when that happened.
But it also seems that after sort of getting that sort of stabilization, I guess, and maybe a bit more of a spark to the team and some real sort of verve finally, in comes the war, right? Which decimates the rosters and certainly, the economic appeal for fans and all that stuff. I mean, it's a hydra-headed issue and far bigger than just, plain old pro sport.
Yeah, but other teams are in a better situation to survive, and the Americans just aren't. They've already been dealt a few blows along the way, and they're just starting to sort of sort of get back on their feet a little bit, whereas other teams were in a situation where they could survive, and they weren't sort of in that struggling situation. And so when the war comes along and all of a sudden Canadian players are joining up or being drafted or aren't being allowed to travel to the U.S. to play because there are limitations and travel restrictions, it really hurts Dutton and his Americans, I think, worse than it hurts Boston and Detroit and Chicago. So he feels the pinch, I think, worse than the other teams.
So during this time, and we're going to get sort of to the exclamation point, which is the final season ultimately, when they, at least in name, changed their name and their appellation to Brooklyn. But was there any effort before that to extricate themselves from the Madison Square Garden lease arrangement?
No. So really short answer, no.
Why? There wasn't any suitable place along the lines of an MSG at that time?
No, there wasn't any thinking along that line yet. Again, moving to Brooklyn was a Hail Mary. And then, so Dutton it was a Hail Mary by Dutton. And there was no suitable arena. Dwyer had already made that attempt. He made that Hail Mary pass and it had failed. And so with Dutton, the idea was to stabilize it and try to keep things going. And then when he realized that he couldn't keep things alive at Madison Square Garden any longer, then he decided, okay, I'm going to make a move. And then that's how we get to that last season. And he'd started to have that thought a little bit before then, but it was in that last season that he made that decision to move. And again, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself now a bit in the storytelling, but when he makes that move, it's in name only, really, because there's no suitable arena for them to play games in Brooklyn yet. There's a small arena there for them to. There's the Brooklyn Ice Palace for them to practice at, but that's not a suitable arena for them to play games in. They can only hold practices. So he's encouraging the players to live in Brooklyn, to be part of the community. And even that doesn't happen all at once. They sort of ease into that. And then they practice. They hold their practices there. And these practices are open to the public. So the kids are going down and they're becoming Brooklyn Americans fans. But they play all their games in Madison Square Garden still. Yeah,
that's interesting, right? So they basically are the Brooklyn Americans in, I guess, domicile only, right? But actually then need to schlep across the river to play their games still. Is there any real path, though, or plan to get an arena, or was it hope that somebody would just step up?
And there is a plan, and Dutton had a plan, and he even had land picked out, and he believed that if he could just get the arena built, that it would work. In fact, one of the sites, there's some irony here, and one of the sites that he wanted to build an arena is where the Barclays Center is now, which is where the New York Islanders, well, at least now, are playing. But so that's one of the sites that he wanted to build at. But again, it's the war. By this point, the war is on, and the United States is entering the war. There's a shortage on steel, a shortage on all sorts of other materials, and you're not going to build a hockey arena during the Second World War. It's just not going to happen. And Dutton's got the money; he can bankroll it. Plus, I mean, he's not a small time guy himself. He's got his own construction money behind him, so he can help get this done. But there's just not the material, and there's not the time. The fates are conspiring against him.
Is there any discussion or any thought that maybe the Branch Rickey and the Brooklyn Dodgers, Walter O'Malley and the Brooklyn Dodgers could be potential partner, given their prowess in the borough?
Yeah, no, that never came to be. It's too bad. It would have been great. You would think that that sort of thing could have happened, right? But yeah.
All right. Well, so the Amerks decide to, or maybe you're forced to suspend operations during as the war sort of rolls on, and then circa 45, it seems like Dutton has this notion that the team's going to come back again, and almost, I guess, had full intentions to literally revive it and bring it back. And I think even, if I'm not mistaken, there actually was a group that either he found or stepped up that might be willing or have been willing to actually build an arena in Brooklyn. But despite that, whether it's real or not, maybe you can describe perhaps sort of the denouement here, which seems murky to me because it doesn't seem clear as to why Dutton was unable or couldn't rehabilitate or bring back this team now that the war was over and the NHL was looking towards the future.
So at the end of that fateful season, they suspend the team and they disperse the players. And Dutton agrees to this. He agrees to suspend the team and disperse the players. And what happens is, also it's important to note that during the war, that the original president of the league dies. So Frank Halter dies, and Dutton takes over as president of the league, with the understanding that he'll serve just long enough for him to find a replacement. He ends up serving for the remainder of the war. First time, by the way, that the NHL ever turns a profit is under Red Dutton's leadership. But so the war comes to an end. He hands over the reins, and he says, "Great, I'm ready. I'm going to take back the Brooklyn Americans, and we're going to start up again. And I got everything all ready. We're going to build an arena. We're ready to go." And here's where it gets, I used to say, a little murky. So it's hard to know if it was the Rangers who blocked it, if it was the Boston Bruins that blocked it, if it was both of them. But it's blocked, and it's no, I'm sorry, you can't have the Brooklyn Americans. And it's Conn Smythe who delivers the news with probably just a little too much glee. And he says to him, "No, you can't have your team back." And now, some people say that he said this immediately after that news. Some people say some records indicate that he did this after he was offered the opportunity to put a franchise in Buffalo, which he instantly said a franchise in Buffalo will never be successful. But he said, "You can take your franchise and you can shove it up your ass." And those are his exact words. "You can take your franchise and shove it up your ass." And then he walked out and he said, "As long as I'm alive, the New York Rangers will never win the Stanley Cup." Which puts more credence on the idea that he did blame the New York Rangers for him never getting his team back.
So that was, I guess, in New York Ranger hockey lore referred to. Is that Dutton's curse? Was that what it's called?
Yeah, Dutton's curse.
Until the
Rangers. They never did win the Stanley Cup as long as he was alive. They didn't win it until 94. They went under. With Messier as captain, and some Rangers fans going to take me to task for not knowing that. But
so okay. I mean, what? So I guess we kind of skated over this a little bit. I mean, Dutton essentially was kind of steering the NHL ship through the end of the war, right? And some recompense, right, to be slapped in the face, if you will, by being denied to get back to his team. I mean, I guess I would probably have reacted similarly, maybe even more with even some saltier language. But why? Do you think? Yeah,
he's got a bit of a temper. Dutton always had a bit of a temper, so I'm surprised those are the only words he would have used.
Well, it just seems that the league and the board of governors kind of bent over backwards to kind of keep him engaged, to kind of steer this ship through the challenging years of the war, and you'd think at the very least in terms of showing some sort of appreciation. But you kind of wonder, if it was MSG, if it was the Boston team, if it was some kind of he rubbed some the wrong way, or perhaps they felt that he had expended his energies to the extent that they needed him to do so, and maybe there was some forethought into maybe what the league needed to do in a post-war era, or I don't know. It just seems kind of curious that they would reward, quote unquote, somebody like that with slap in the face.
And you have to think too, Boston and New York had it pretty cozy. they had all of northeastern United States all to themselves. Why would they want a third hockey team in there? They had all of northeastern U.S. divided between the two of them. So why divide it up with another team? Why share it?
So as let's round this up then. Looking back, the NHL actually records the Amherst as actually having quote unquote retired from the league in 1942, right?
Yeah.
Which obviously, arguably probably needs an asterisk right next to it in the history books. But what becomes?
I would argue that, yeah.
Yeah. So then what is left, right? So in essence, they were the number 7 team in this league. And in essence, with its ending, the NHL essentially becomes 6, and this is where this sort of mythology of the original 6 gets forged. Correct?
That's right. Yeah.
Why do you think? So let's expand then into that. Why then, after having nipped the Americans from the roster, why do you think it took so long for the NHL to then further expand? From 6 teams all the way until 1967. It seems like a really long time.
Well, that's a good question, and that's a question that I've wrestled with, and I know others have as well. And there's been a lot of books written about it, so I don't know that my answer will be a definitive answer for sure. But it was the era between then and the end of the 67-68 season is sort of not only is it called the original 6, but it's also considered the golden era of the NHL. And some of that, I think, is because of baby boomers who look back on it with rose-colored glasses and see the Technicolor photos and the televised footage and that sort of thing. But I think there was always hints of wanting to make the league larger, but owners were quite happy to have their own little fiefdoms. And the idea was if there were more teams, then there were more opportunities for players to play elsewhere, and then there was less opportunities to control. When there was the final decision to expand, Conn Smythe, who by then had basically walked away from the Leafs, he'd had enough of the shenanigans of Harold Ballard and Stafford Smythe, and said, you guys are screwing up the Leafs and Maple Leaf Gardens and the legacy I've left, so I'm out of here. But he left a parting shot for the NHL, and he said, when it comes to expansion, be careful what you wish for. And people kind of like, you're just being a kook. But when you look at expansion and you look at the teams that came in, it was a mixed bag, and it didn't always work out well for the NHL. So that maybe that there's a reason. Maybe we should be thankful that they didn't expand very quickly. But I don't know if I answered that question very well or not. But that's sort of my thoughts on it.
And I think it's also interesting too. One last sort of note on Dutton, right? He literally walked away from the game. I think it was something on the order of like 34 years before he even made a public
It
appearance.
wasn't until they had an anniversary of the Calgary team that he played on, when the Calgary Flames had an anniversary night to recognize that, and they invited him to drop the puck. And it was also coincided with the opening of something. The Flames had him out for that. That was the first time that he stepped back into an NHL arena.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember too that Dutton still, despite the animosity that lingered post this situation in 45, 46, was inducted in the Hockey Hall of Fame up in Toronto in 1958, and was part of the Hall of Fame selection committee for 15 years, and he was still nominally or at least sort of at an emeritus level, sort of involved or related to the NHL.
Yeah, and funny enough, his construction company, West, built hockey arenas as well for amateur hockey and that sort of thing. And he did a great, and he was always involved at the grassroots level, but he wanted nothing to do with NHL hockey rinks and being in there and being a part of those games. It soured him, and the man held a grudge. There's just no denying it. And he'd given his heart and soul to the New York Americans in trying to save that team. And the NHL screwed him. And so he basically said, screw you guys, I'm out of here.
All right, two last questions, and thank you so much for your this is fascinating because to me, to know, if you're a Rangers fan in the NHL today, right? To I think it's important to at least know and remember that there was a team that literally and maybe even directly preceded your franchise, and frankly, very related to even today's ownership with today's modern day Madison Square Garden owns the Rangers, so that connection is still very, very tight. But let me ask you these last two questions. Number one. Is there anything behind sort of any story or anecdote about the nickname, the Amerks? I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that correctly, but I know it's obviously an abbreviation, but any knowledge or thought or understanding about maybe why that name became kind of so synonymous as a nickname?
I only know it as the abbreviation. I wish I had a better story for you, but I only ever knew it as the abbreviation of the Americans. And I don't know anything else. Yeah, I wish I had a better story for you.
All right, well, we'll put it out there. We'll put it out there to our audience because you'd be surprised as to who knows what and follows this kind of stuff. And we find ourselves in very dusty, musty corners. And I
dug, too. I did a lot of digging on it, and nothing came up. And I asked people in interviews, and I didn't find anybody who could tell me. So.
And not even, to my last question, the one, the only Larry King. You think you know everything about Brooklyn, right? How did you find Larry, and how did he become convinced to, or how did you convince him to be the narration for this film?
So Larry King. So early on, Stephen M. Cohen is an executive producer. His wife is also an executive producer on the film. And so we would have conference there. They live in Brooklyn. And I live up here in Ontario, and so we would have conference calls to discuss the film. And so early on in the film, we're talking on a conference call, and we're saying, it'd be great to have a Brooklyn voice to tell this story. And I'm saying, yeah, that would be great. And we've established a budget, and it's a modest budget. And then they'd say, yeah, it'd be great. And Stephen Cohen says, yeah, it'd be great if Larry could do it. And his wife says, yeah, Larry'd be great. And you have to keep in mind that when I do these films, everybody's got a buddy or a friend who wants to be in a film or has a great voice for this or can do this narration for you or can play the piano. Everybody's got a buddy or a friend. And so I kind of sighed heavily and I said, oh, so Larry, okay. So does Larry have any experience? And there's this pause. And yeah, he's got a little bit of experience. I said, oh, okay. So Larry, who's Larry? And Stephen says, Larry King. And I thought they were joking. So I said, oh, great. You get Larry King to do narration. I'll get my buddy Bobby De Niro to do some of the voiceover work. And crickets on the other end. They didn't appreciate my joke. Turns out they weren't joking. They were serious. And Stephen says in a very strong voice, no, Larry's a family friend. He's friends with my father since childhood. Oh. So anyway, so long story short, Larry King is friends with Stephen Cohen's dad, and they've been friends since they were kids. They grew up in the same neighborhood in Brooklyn. And Larry King was a Brooklyn Americans fan. He watched the Brooklyn Americans as a kid during that one season. And so that's how he came on board. And that's how we got Larry King.
All right, all you New York Rangers know-it-alls fans out there in the metro area, you blue shirts in Section 400 up in the MSG balcony and the rafters, make sure that you do recognize, pay some homage to the remembrances, the history of the team that preceded you in Madison Square Garden, the third version of the MSG, and that is the New York/Brooklyn Americans, and that is a wealth of information from Dale, who we thank tremendously for walking us through that story, a bit of that history. I'm sure there's some other tangents to that story that are well worth digging into further. And I cannot highly recommend enough the film. It is called Only the Dead Know the Brooklyn Americans. It is narrated by the one, the only Larry King. It is available just about wherever you can find films. You can find it, as Dale mentioned, on iTunes. It is available on Amazon, both in DVD form or as a Prime Video stream. It's available on demand on various platforms. I think it'd be really cool to have a few more screenings. Maybe we can help sort of get some of those maybe underway at a theater near you. You can have a very convenient link to the movie from our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode. I think it's going to be episode 79 with Dale Morrisey. And you will find a couple of links to various forms of this movie. Again, Only the Dead Know the Brooklyn Americans. It came out, I think, in 2017, last year. Yep, indeed. And Dale Morrisey is the writer, the director, the producer. Larry King is the narrator, and it's chock full of fun stuff. Stan Fischler is in there. There's a whole bunch of other stuff in there. Fascinating story. If you grew up in New York or are a longtime hockey fan in and around the New York area, or frankly just an NHL fan, and want to know what the hell was going on with this league before the quote-unquote original six, you owe it to yourself. And frankly, even just for the color vivid imagery of those sweaters, which are arguably some of the best, if not the best, in NHL history in terms of design and logo creation and color scheme and all that stuff. It's a very, very interesting story. A whole bunch of stuff that I didn't know about, and interesting all around the Brooklyn/New York Americans. Before we run, I want to say thank you tremendously to our friend Jerry Payne and Podfly Productions. Make sure that you check out Podfly at podfly.net. You want to get some help, some assistance, some production work, and guidance in any of your podcasting journeys, by all means, give them a try. Tell them that we here at Good Seats Still Available sent you. Podfly.net. Okay, that is it. I think we've wrapped it up. Terrific. Dale, thank you so much. Listeners, thank you so much. And we'll see you next week with some more fun-filled journeys into the world of forgotten sports. Until then, I bid you all a fond adieu. Good night and good luck.